question I'm going to ask comes from an audience member, especially around how you close your lecture around what we can do and what inspires us. This comes from someone who's running for mayor of a small town. They're aware of the Democratic backsliding that often happens in a subtle way, often even at the local level. What signs indicate that the authoritarian tendencies are taking root, and what steps can this person take to combat it?
And this person what?
Take to combat the steps towards authoritarianism, even at the local level.
Yeah, so I mentioned 7 ways to get involved. I didn't mention running for office, which is actually what we are seeing happen across the board, because people are seeing in our own communities. We talk about all politics is local and all development is local. I can't do the same work in Mali that I do in Michigan. I can't even do the same work in Mali that I do in Sudan. But I think what you see in your communities are always different. I'll tell you what the Carter Center did. We recognized that, and in small towns across the United States, in 7 different states, we went in and we found a right-leaning lead and a left-leaning lead. And they built teams, and they had critical conversations. In North Carolina, it's called the North Carolina Trust for Free and Fair Elections, and it was a Supreme Court justice, a Republican, retired, and the Democratic mayor of Charlotte, and they went on a bus tour to 14 counties, and they listened. And so as running for a mayor or being just a citizen, you have to listen to find out what is bothering people. I will say in Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, who is now our new senator there, she had told the Harris campaign, I can't campaign with you anymore because you're talking about one issue and Michiganders care about something else. And so I think it's not all a federal level issue. It is building from the ground up. So when you look and you see that people aren't listening to each other, that's when you can tell that the polarization has become such that you're never going to be able to convince anyone of anything. So you have to find the things that you agree in. Do you agree that there should be shelters so when the kids are standing at the bus stop, waiting for the bus they're out of the sun or the rain or the snow? And if you can agree on that, then find that way to work together. And I think as a mayor of a small town, you will find that people have existed living with their neighbors for a long time and they've been fine, and now suddenly they aren't. So I think you need to listen, you need to address those concerns.
And in the same vein, going back to your own inspiration, how do we encourage young people to safeguard free thought and, being able to participate in some of these conversations? Because, these impact all ages and is their future.
I think you will find that lots of organizations have something called Next Gen, which is the next generation. And I think being supportive of programs that work with Next Gen is important, because that's actually, we're missing civic education. The civic education I learned in school, my kids didn't have the same class. They didn't have the same responsibility to learn that. And so they can learn it later in life, but it has to be through an umbrella organization or somebody or something taking interest in making sure they learn.
We've got quite a few questions around just what the Carter Center does, and especially around their work in the Middle East. Can you speak a little bit around that?
Sure. Well, President Carter, of course, was responsible for the largest safety treaty that Israel has ever had on its border, looking primarily at Egypt and the Camp David Accords. And so one of the things he recognized at the time was that he missed the opportunity to bring the Palestinians into the discussion. And he spent 40 years at the Carter Center trying to bring that intra-Palestinian dialogue into a discussion. And so we have continued that work. And it is incredibly important because I think, again, if you're not talking to all sides, you won't know what the other side is thinking. You won't know how to get to the answers. And that's what he did 13 days at Camp David. There was a lot of negotiation and compromise, and that's the work that we're working on now. Not with U.S. funding. We do it behind the scenes. It's very quiet, but it's something that we're deeply engaged in.
And then in that work, how does the Carter Center navigate with or around unfriendly regimes or those who don't want to see this work possibly even taking place?
So that goes from Mali and the government there, Sudan in the middle of their current war, to the Middle East. All of them, you have to engage in those conversations. And so the Carter Center, we call balls and strikes. We look at countries and we call out when they are doing something wrong. Sometimes we do it quietly because we're in the middle of conversations and negotiations that you can't actually publicly say what you want to say. But I think that it's important that people call the balls and strikes on what's happening.
You mentioned authoritarianism revolving around the leader and his survival. What happens when such a leader is unable to remain in power, at least legitimately, or through death or term limits? Is there always a successor that takes the reins? Can you maybe speak of some examples in which that happened or did not happen?
Yeah, so, Javier talked on Tuesday about sometimes there are women behind the thrones, sort of, as the puppeteers. And we saw this in Argentina, where Isabel Perón came back after her husband was killed. We've seen it in various places where it's a family member. And so we watch that family lineage, and we also watch what the opposition is able and capable of doing. And if there isn't a strong voice, as President Clinton had said, a strong and wrong leader versus a weak and right leader, that's the important thing, is building up those weak organs that have started to atrophy. So we have seen in many cases where other people come in, but it's a pendulum swing. And I can't say it's a one-size-fits-all, because in Hungary, we started with a reformer and we ended up with an authoritarian. In the US, you've seen this go back and forth, and this is how we work. It is how governments are supposed to work. It's the checks and balances that form that. But I would say in various countries, we've seen weak leaders come in after strong men, and they've then failed. So that's some of the space that we watch.
It seems the traditional elites in society are less threatened by pluralism than the middle and working classes. The fear seems to be a primary dissatisfaction with democracy. Why do you think this is that way, and how do we address it?
So why do I think the other people are dissatisfied?
Yes.
So, well, again, if 50% of Americans are one catastrophe away from losing their house, that's likely not any of us in this room. And so when we don't see that, when we don't hear that, when we don't listen to that, that's when we get lost. You have to have those conversations in your own community. These aren't federal policies. Sometimes these are state policies, and sometimes they're local policies. I will tell you, the Carter Center runs a program called Inform Women, Transform Lives. And we started it overseas, and now we work in 35 cities across 5 continents. And we find city governments that are working on very specific issues to help vulnerable populations. So the city government has stepped in. I'll give you the example, because we do this in Atlanta, we do this in Chicago, we do it in Nairobi and Bangladesh and all over the world. I'll give you an example. In Chicago, there is a 3-in-1 card that if you were under a certain level, you're a woman and you qualified, you could get a free transit card, a public library card, and also a federal ID, all with one card, but no one was using it. And so it took a while for the Chicago government to figure out no one's using this, and so we helped them run a campaign. In Nairobi, there was a gender-based violence issue. People were being abused, and they didn't have a number to call, except for the Nairobi city government actually provided a number for them to call. So we helped run a campaign by putting a billboard up in the market. And they went from 10 calls one month to 400 calls that month. That's 390 people who didn't know that they actually had a service that the city provided. And so sometimes it's a matter of just looking at what your city provides and then leaning in and helping your city provide that to more vulnerable populations, because we need to help them, because we're all going to end up in a situation that does not look good if we are paying for them in the long run.
As Hannah Nicole Jones has reminded us, the American experiment in democracy has never been perfected. How do we focus less upon returning to a flawed standard, but rather focus on building a better society that sets a new high water mark where more justice and greater equity prevail? Should we move forward, not back?
Well, we should absolutely move forward. I think democracy is an experiment that we are still working in. We're only 250 years old, and we've seen a lot of pendulum swings. And as I said, we've seen authoritarianism in our country before in different ways. So I think as we try to build back better, to use an overused statement, it is incredibly important to make sure that we focus on the things that work. I'm not ready to give up and say democracy doesn't work. I truly think that we're in a space where if we take it upon ourselves, if we are willing to engage, if we don't crawl, stick our head in the sand and just throw our hands up in despair, if we all engage, I think that the new democracy we will see is one that is going to uplift more people. And that is what I'm hoping for. But we do need to get to that place where we're recognizing not everyone is seeing that democracy delivers.
Well, let's all thank Ms. Paige Alexander for her wonderful lecture today.